Hi there, this is Dr. Elaine Gregory, and this is Accounting 667 Advanced Audit. And today we're going to be looking at Chapter 9, Evidence-Based Fraud Examinations. When we are looking at fraud examinations, we have to answer some questions. Who committed the fraud? What was the target of the fraud? Where did it occur and when did it occur? How did it occur and why it occurred? Now, of all of these questions, the why is going to be maybe the hardest to get because that's the rationale that the fraudster is going to explain to you why they did what they did. And you need to remember that fraudsters are fraudsters because they lie and deceive. So we really don't know why the fraud occurred. So we really can't trust what they have to say. You might be able to find some corroborating information, such as, I had to steal the money because my spouse lost their job. And yes, you go back and you find that the spouse lost their job. But that could be one reason, but there might be other reasons why. And the why there are a lot of studies out there that ask why people do it. But it's very hard when you're talking to a fraudster to understand whether or not they're lying or telling you the truth. The rest of it, we can figure out. So looking at the who, what, where, when, how, at least the how, up to the how, we might need to develop some hypotheses as to what may be occurring that might have led to the fraud. So if and to what extent was cash stolen from the petty cash account? And then we want to take a look at the hypotheses saying there was a significant amount of cash stolen from the petty cash account. Maybe there was an insignificant amount of cash stolen from the petty cash account, or perhaps there was no cash that was really stolen. Maybe it was all timing issues of when things were recorded. But based on the hypotheses and that question, the if and to what extent question, we want to then move into conducting substantive tests to either accept or reject that hypothesis. There was no fraud that occurred. There was fraud that occurred. It could look like fraud, but could have been an error. So we want to reduce our testing to the most consistent with the evidence that's presented. There was, there wasn't. Now, developing the hypothesis can be time consuming, but it allows us to do the greatest application of research and evidence. Because the better your if and to what question is, the more concise your evidence is going to be, and the stronger argument you're going to have for your conclusions. In the back of your mind, from the day one to the day last of a fraud examination or forensic examination, you have to be able to explain everything to prosecutors, to attorneys, to juries, to judges. So for each component, you have to be able to explain the who, the what, the when, the why, the how. You can speculate on the why, but again, you really don't know. A term we're going to learn in our class is what we call predication. And according to page 289 of your text, it's the totality of the circumstances that would lead a reasonable, professionally trained, and prudent individual to believe that a fraud has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur. So you can't just be suspicious. I think there's fraud. You have to go on the predication that in totality of the circumstances and the evidence you gain, that a reasonable, prudent individual would come to the same conclusion that you did. You can start by receiving a tip from a hotline, a fraud tip hotline. That can start the process. Doesn't mean there's fraud. It means it's a tip. So the tip can start the process, but you'll need that supporting evidence. And just simple red flags are not sufficient. I saw the person driving a very fancy car. Well, that person may have been driving a loaner car or a rental car. So it can't be based on suspicions. You need that supporting evidence, and it can't be just that the red flag stands alone. You would use that red flag and investigate. Oh, how often did that person drive that fancy car? Every day. Okay. Made you take your shoes off when you had to get into the car. Okay. So there's an indication that maybe it's their car. Yes, they were bragging at lunchtime. They got a great deal. Well, no one gets a great deal for that type of car. So the red flag can not stand alone, but it can add to as part of the entire investigation. We always go back to the fraud triangle: rationalization, opportunity, and pressure. Let's take a deeper look. Opportunity. There may be a lack or an end around internal controls. Maybe senior management has abdicated their review process or oversight. Rationalization. I haven't received a raise, so I deserve one. Or I never intended to steal the money. I was only going to borrow it and pay it back. I was involved with a fraud where the person that wrote their confession wrote that they took the money with the intent of it was going to be a short-term loan and they were going to pay it back. Then things just got out of hand. Okay, they tried to re-rationalize their original rationalization. And remember, you can never be sure that that's really the truth. What are the motives or pressures that could be inherent to the company or external to the company? For example, personal financial pressures and addictions are external, something going on outside that is affecting, pushing the motivation. An internal pressure could be compensation for results. If you make a 5% increase or decrease in something, you'll get paid an extra bonus. There's a motive. We also want to look at the concept of mice, not those little brown furry friends of ours, but the idea of what mice stands for. Was it because of money? Pure greed. Was it because of an ideology? Maybe this is a person that supports the philosophy is they don't believe in paying taxes because taxes were really only implemented during wartime and we're not in wartime, so we shouldn't have to pay taxes. Could be coercion. You are a willing or unwilling victim. You might be willing to do it if the person says, hey, you shoot me a false check for $100, I'll pay you 50. Okay, it's a willing victim. You're going to suffer, your company's going to suffer, but you're willing to do it. You're willing to be coerced versus maybe administrative pressure. I'm the CEO. I expect you to do exactly what I say. I know it's best for the company. You'll lose your job. Ego or entitlement. Maybe somebody's on a power kick and they're abusing their position. I want to fly first class because I'm the CEO of a company. You give me first class tickets. I'm not going to fly business class commercial. I want preferential treatment because of my position. Now that we're starting to think within the fraud triangle, we have to start looking for evidence to confirm or refute that hypothesis. And so evidence is just really anything: testimony, physical evidence, demonstrative, graphs, charts, documents, anything that supports the hypothesis of the auditor. If you are one that is gathering evidence, I do not gather evidence in my investigations. I have law enforcement agencies gather evidence for me if it is a law enforcement case. I don't like to touch the evidence. I ask them to pull the evidence, make a photocopy of me saying this is a copy of evidence, and where the evidence, keep the evidence in the evidence locker, and give me the photocopy. I don't want there to ever be a breakage of the chain of custody. However, sometimes you have to do that. We had one instance on an investigation where the one of the co-conspirators was saying that we had found a money counting machine in their bedroom, and it was still plugged in. So we knew it had to have been operating. And the person said they didn't know anything about it. They sleep soundly through the night. They never heard it. So what we had to do was get custody through the chain of evidence, marking who touched it and when. We were given access to that money counting machine, and we tested it. We did a video recording and we tested it to determine how loud it was. And you know, it's kind of loud. Money counting machines can be really loud. So we were able to authenticate that that was the money counting machine that was taken from the home, because there was a chain of evidence on it. And then we put it back. Make sure you put it back. But we had the videotape. We ended up using it in the trial itself because the defense felt that the video wasn't correct because we had the ability to increase the volume of the video. So we had to bring the machine in and test it in front of the jury. It's pretty convincing. But always handle your evidence carefully. If you don't know how to do it, don't do it. There's training programs on it, but work with law enforcement. When we're thinking about evidence, as we're running around gathering it, wherever it's coming from, we have to make sure that it meets three characteristics. One, it has to be relevant to the case. It has to make sense to the case. It has to substantiate or support the existence of the case. And it must be able to withstand cross-examination. So it must be relevant. It must be reliable to the case. Who or what provided the source of that evidence? And finally, it must be valid. What's the accuracy and integrity of the information that's being given? Can it be corroborated? So let's talk about that money counting machine. Was it relevant to the case? Yes. We found boxes of money. Money counting machine. All packaged up with the little money band on them. Dated by the person for whatever reason. So we knew that the money machine was relevant to the case because there was money found at the scene. We were able to substantiate the existence of the money machine because when they came in, pictures were taken on where it was located, and you could see in the pictures personal effects of the conspirators. So we knew we could tie the money machine to the case. And it must be competent. Yeah, it's a money machine. It withstood any cross-examination. Was it that money machine? Yes, it was. Why? We have a chain of evidence. It must be reliable to the case. Who provided it? Well, the defendants did. In their home, seized by law enforcement, properly identified and secured as evidence. And it must be valid. What's the integrity and the accuracy. Well, we said that the hypothesis was you could not sleep through this because it was so loud. So we had to demonstrate it so that we could prove that it was accurate. And we had it corroborated. We not only had a videotape of it, but we also brought it in as evidence. When we're thinking of going into a fraud examination, we need to think about it in the idea that it's going to go to court. It's going to go to trial. So we have to organize and document our work so it is so well organized and so well documented that it will withstand that cross-examination. So you want to keep details as to gathering and organizing the documents. In one investigation, we were going through a home and we were looking at the assets, and I brought a little small tape recorder, and as we walked through, I was verbally documenting what was in each room and then determining which assets should be seized. So we gathered and organized the documents and the evidence. See pages 720 and 721 of your text for a sample of how to gather and organize evidence. It is precise, but it's document, document, document. What you really want to end up with is the documentation is so well done that you could hand it off to anybody and they could replicate the work that you did and come out with the same result. That's how well you want to do it. This may include photographs, digital evidence, spreadsheets, photocopies, any working papers that might you use to create and manage your thoughts that lead you to the conclusion of the evidence. When we think of evidence, think of it as lots of little pieces to a puzzle. So you've got all these puzzle pieces scattered, and slowly you start linking them together. You put the edges, you do the edges first, or do a big color first, and then you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. That's what evidence is. Evidence, all the evidence links to the bigger picture, which is the allegation. It's an iterative process. As more information comes to light, the puzzle can become clearer to you. So you want to gather enough that's sufficient enough that you have a good picture of what's going on. You could use different types of analysis tools that we've covered, such as big data or artificial intelligence. We could do substantive testing, look at the internal controls, use red flags, work with them all together. All of these become pieces of that puzzle. As I said, anything that supports the assertion of the case is evidence. It could be paper, it could be electronic, it could come from the client. We go to the place of the client. It can come from the litigants. It could come from public records in the internet. What you want to do is make sure that the evidence can be authenticated. You want to make sure that there's signatures that prove somebody forged a name. You probably want handwriting experts in there. Look for alterations. Was that document altered? And sometimes you have to look very carefully to see if there's maybe different font, different typeface, maybe margins shifted a little in the alteration. Look for a photo, you can use a photocopy, but you really want the original. But put the original in evidence and use the photocopy for your own notes. But the question is it a photocopy or is it the original document? You know the difference between a photocopied invoice and a real invoice. Look at dates and times as far as the sequencing of the creation. Do you have a document that was recorded in the financial records on one day, but post that date, all of a sudden the invoice is date stamped? Look at sequences. Now, evidence can be part of the act, part of the concealment, or part of the conversion. So we want to be aware that evidence can be part of all of those three components or can link one component to another. And that's what we call, part of it is, we also want to look at invigilation. Invigilation. I can't even say the word. And what it means is we look at the periods before, during, and after the fraud has occurred. If the fraud was the falsification of an invoice, we want to make sure that before that fraud occurred, was that invoice actually in there and we missed it? Did that fraudulent invoice appear during the time that the fraud took place? Or maybe it was stuffed in there to conceal a fraud that had already occurred. We will get more into this in later chapters, but interviewing and interrogation. Interviewing may be face-to-face or through a deposition. I've sat for depositions in the past, and you have the transcriptionist there, you have your attorneys, they have their attorneys, they have evidence on the table, they have somebody that kind of monitors it, facilitates it, and they ask you questions, you answer the questions. You can stop it at any time if you need to go out and talk to your attorney about a question that you have or how the evidence is being presented. An interrogation goes beyond the interview. Interviews are information gathering. Interrogations are admission seeking. They're trying to get the subject to confess. Interviews and interrogations can be used to gather additional or new evidence, or you can call somebody in and do what we call validating the evidence. Can you confirm that this is a purchase order from your company? Can you confirm that this is your handwriting on the document ordering these goods? No, it's not my handwriting. Okay, we've confirmed it's not your handwriting. I'm not going to get into this part because this really starts to go into private investigation and law enforcement, but there's other ways to gather evidence: surveillance, covert operations, confidential sources. During one case that we had of drug trafficking, the law enforcement officer put a pole camera up like 100 yards from the house, and it was being monitored, and we could see when people were coming and going. We had information on the cars and those other possible co-conspirators or some victims from the crimes there. So they couldn't say, well, we went to bed at 9 and slept through the night. Well, no, we have on camera people coming at midnight, 1 o'clock, and 2 o'clock in the morning. Explain that to me. So there's all kinds of ways we can get other pieces of evidence to corroborate evidence. Now I want to talk specifically about evidence regarding concealment. And I pulled these two charts from the Occupational Fraud 2022, a report from the nation's survey report from the ACFE, which you have in your class resources. What we see here is 32% altered physical documents. Remember what I said? Has it been altered? Are you looking for alterations? Are you comparing invoices, several invoices from the same company? Maybe you see that the invoice changes in some kind. Maybe it doesn't look the same. You can always call that company and confirm, did you change the style of your invoicing? No, we've always had these invoices for years and this is the way we do it. Okay, well now you know there's some alteration that's been done. 25% concealed electronically. This is where you're probably going to need a specialist in IT that can go in and see how documentation was electronically altered. Now, the top 5 conceal methods, and then we looked at the evidence. Manual alteration, 57%. 38% not only concealed it manually, they concealed it electronically. They were really working on it. So always examine documents to make sure that they are the real document. And they are the document that the company should be receiving. Sometimes you'll have a 3-part document, so it's carbonized. So when they write on the original, it goes to a yellow copy and a pink copy. Well, make sure that the company that the copy is going to the correct entity. Perhaps we only send the original top copy of the invoice, but somehow your supporting documentation has the pink copy, which should be retained at the other company site. So look for things like that. Compare invoices throughout the year by the same company. You can also look for concealment through the general ledger and the reconciliation items. So look in the general ledger. Do we have debit transactions in accounts with a nominal credit balance? Do we have debit transactions in revenue accounts? We should never have that. Well, what if there was a return? Then you use the returns and allowance account, right? You wouldn't use reversal of revenue. Are there credit accounts and expenses? Should never be credit accounts and expenses. Expenses should always have a debit entry. Do we have miscellaneous accounts, such as miscellaneous revenue, miscellaneous expenses? Are we concealing transactions through those that should really be appearing in its correct account? Are there adjusting entries to interest income, expenses, interest expense, bank fees, estimates at the end of the year, such as depreciation, that are missing or incorrect? Did we say we reconciled the bank balance on a piece of paper, but we never adjusted it in the general ledger? Do tax records tie back to the general ledger? Is the tax record saying one thing and the financial statement saying another? So these are ways that, again, the concealment of fraud could take place. Now looking at conversion, how do we convert or launder the illegal act? Hidden assets. We use hidden assets to convert the theft. Hidden bank accounts. I've given you a couple of articles on Rita Crundwell, who was the controller of the city of Dixon, Illinois, who stole approximately $54 million from a very small town over many, many years. While the auditor did their due diligence by confirming the bank balances, they did not ask the bank to search out any other balances, any other accounts that Rita Crundwell had created. And there were I believe four bank accounts that Rita Crundwell was laundering money through when she was stealing. Purchases of assets through straw buyers. Drug dealers convert cash to assets, but maybe they don't put them in their name. So you might want to do some research on the address itself of the suspected. Maybe they bought a home through a straw buyer. Who really owns that home? Maybe they put it in the name of a family member who may be an unwilling victim because they're living in the house and all of a sudden it's seized because it was purchased using drug money. Purchases of assets with cash. We had a drug case in Washington State where what tipped off the entire drug case was a woman that was a co-conspirator went into a jewelry store with literally a brown paper bag full of money and wanted to buy some jewels, wanted to buy some rings, bracelets, very high-end stuff, and had just a bag of cash. That alerted the store to contact the law enforcement agency and said, hey, we're getting this. No, they can accept or reject the sale. They were told to accept the sale. Cash is cash, but we would be monitoring it. And what it did is it actually started an investigation of drug trafficking. There could be hidden accounts throughout the company, so you need to look deeply to see if there's unusual things going on that could alert you to it. And finally, I won't cover it because I've never worked with it before, but working with offshore accounts. Is money being laundered or moved offshore? Now, here's some red flags. We've talked about red flags in the past, but let's dive into a few of them. Inadequate, sloppy, no books. You have a business, but you don't keep any records. Or lack of source documents. You've got invoices that you've paid, but you have no invoice copies. What are you doing with it? Review tax records, omitted income, phantom expenses, ratio analysis. Make sure that you are being cognizant and aware of ratio analysis that could be affected by things other than what you're looking for, such as pandemics, supply chain shortages. But look at the ratio analysis. That might give you some trends to look at. Look at the nature of the business that does not align with income. We had a drug trafficking case, lots of drug trafficking cases in Washington, where the person sat down and said, I'm not a drug trafficker. I'm just a fisherman. See, out there in the backyard is my boat. I take my boat up to Alaska and I fish. Okay. And how much do you make fishing? $50,000 a year on a good year. Okay, well, that's not bad. Kind of risky, but it's not bad. So how did you have $100,000 Mercedes Benz in the parking in your garage? How is your spouse wearing jewelry that clearly exceeds your income? So if the nature of the business doesn't align with the income, you want to ask about it. Now, some suggestions that you could do to look for this. Perform a reverse income statement. We call it the indirect method. Look at all the disbursements, because they're going to call out their disbursements. They may omit their revenue, but they will post they'll put their expenses in the books, because expenses lead to perhaps a reduction of taxes. So identify all the known disbursements and then backtrack and see if you can align the disbursements back to income. Do confirmations with the banks, and don't ask for just the account names of that entity. Look for others. Ask, are there any other accounts in so-and-so's name, so-and-so's name? Sometimes business family members they have accounts drawn up on family members' names. Maybe some of the accounts are hidden with a spouse or children. Use the internet to search on those properties, the Secretary of State or the Treasurer. Use UCC business filings. Look for divorce records. Look for other names that might be associated that are connected to that home. Another method you might use is what we call the net worth method. Identify all the known assets and their values. Then you subtract all the obligations out there to the creditors. What's left is your net worth. If it's positive, the remainder of that excess income might be illegal income. You have more income coming in that is supporting your business. But where's that other sales don't match up, Or negative, the company may be incurring debt and the assets may be hidden off books of the business or on the person. Look for lifestyle probes. Assess the relationship between income and lifestyle. A case that I worked on was the Rhonda Briard case in Washington, where it was about $10-12 million investment scam. Rhonda Briard had a number of homes listed with other members of the family that were interest-only loans, so no money had to go out for the principal. Trips, memberships, private schools, elite clubs. Look for that lifestyle. Look for the evidence. Go beyond the individual. Go to their family, children. Look for investments accounts where there may be investment accounts in children's names holding a large sum of money without rationale behind it. Residences and straw owners' names. Storage facilities that might hide assets. When you're looking through the expenses of the subject or the target, are there storage facilities being paid for? Maybe assets in there. Look at mortgage records, changes of attitude and behavior. Check with the bank. Anything over $10,000 has to have a SAR report on it, or a CTR to report large transactions and suspicious activities. Compare deposits at banks with all known cash expenditures. Remember, they're not going to lie about the cash expenditures, but they're going to lie about the income. Positive differences may be unknown sources that you might have to investigate. Old-fashioned T accounts. Money in, money out. And align that T account with the W-2. There's an excellent example in the book where you take the W-2 of that person, you deduct all the expenses that they've reflected, and you say, can you live on that? That was approach we took when we talked to that fisherman. We looked at your W-2. You earned $50,000, but you have all these expenses that $50,000 wouldn't cover. Where's that other money coming from? And again, look at tables 9.9-4 through 9-9. Great tables on where does evidence come from. Internet, county state property records, liens, mortgages, corporation documents, divorce records of former spouses. So it can come from anywhere, and it can be virtually anything that supports the hypothesis of the argument you are making in your fraud examination. If you have any questions, please post to the class questions for the good of all. Send out a Halo message, or you can make an appointment to me through Calendly. Have a blessed week, and I will see you in the classroom.